Greetings and welcome to Gripping Horror. On October 1st, 2007, two open water divers were led by their incompetent instructor who suddenly deviated from their open water dive course in the Gulf of Mexico, deciding to lead them into Buzz Springs' treacherous cave system, an unplanned and dangerous move. The instructor, fully aware of the risks, yet overconfident and deceitful, falsely assured them of his training in cave diving. Leaving the safety of open water, they ventured into the cave with minimal air, no backup lights, and no cave diving experience. What began as a routine training dive quickly turned into a life-threatening ordeal in the depths of the unforgiving cavern. This is the Buzz Spring disaster of 2007. This story begins with a man named James Francis Cummings, who was known as Jim to many. Born on January 20, 1967, in Long Island City, Queens, he was the cherished son of Robert J. Cummings and Maria Toney. Jim was a spirited individual with a quick wit and an adventurous nature. This enthusiasm often led him into situations that tested his limits, as he tended to dive headfirst into challenges without fully considering the consequences. His boldness, while endearing, sometimes found him in over his head. After graduating from Crystal River High School in 1985, he attended Auburn University, where he was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Army. He later earned a law degree from Thomas Cooley Law School in Lansing, Michigan, establishing a successful practice in Citrus County, where he became a well-known Inverness attorney. But diving remained Jim's one true love. Richard Anderson, who worked for Jim as an investigator in his law office, stated that all he ever talked about was diving, diving, diving. Jim operated a dive shop in Crystal River called Offshore Adventure Dive Center, where he shared his passion for the underwater world with others. His enthusiasm for diving was infectious, drawing in divers of all skill levels, eager to explore the rich marine life and stunning underwater landscapes. Jim's shop became a hub for the diving community, fostering friendships and unforgettable adventures beneath the waves. Around that time, Jim faced challenges beyond his diving exploits. He had been disbarred, which cast a shadow over his legal career. This setback added a layer of complexity to his life, but it didn't dampen his love for the ocean. He channeled his energy into his dive shop and diving. This is where Project 1100 came into play. At the time, the world record for the deepest scuba dive was 1,044 feet, held by a South African diver, Nuno Gomes. With newfound free time after his disbarment, Jim was determined to break that record and wasn't afraid to share his ambitious plans on his now deleted MySpace blog, which was evident in several of his posts. In his About Me section, Jim wrote, "My name is Jim. I have been a scuba diver since 1985 and have dove all over the world. I have dove to depths greater than 600 feet as a technical diver, and my only regret has been that I have not gone even deeper. The current world record depth for a scuba dive is 1,044 feet, held by a South African diver. I intend to break that record in 2008. Together with some of the most experienced technical divers in the world, I intend to dive from the surface to a depth of 1,100 feet. Thus the name Project 1100. It's going to be physically taxing, life-threatening, and moderately expensive. Any help that any of you can give, either through dive knowledge or monetary contribution, would be appreciated and recognized. Together, let's unravel a little more mystery that makes up the other 3/4 of our world." Some saw Jim as a bold visionary, fueled by an unwavering passion for deep-sea exploration, while others viewed him as overly daring, undeterred by the extreme hazards of pushing limits underwater. His posts on his Project 1100 blog reveal a fierce desire to set new records, but beneath his confidence, there were hints he might have underestimated the challenges ahead. To experienced divers, Jim's goal of reaching 1100 feet sounded alarmingly ambitious, a reminder of the grave risks when ambition outpaces preparation. In record-breaking attempts, the boundary between bravery and recklessness can be perilously thin. On September 1st, 2007, Jim shared this post on his MySpace blog. Today's deep dive was usually uneventful, moving to 300 feet next week on the way to the 1100-foot dive record, tentatively planned for August of 2008. Next week still puts me over 300 feet away from my personal deepest. However, I'm planning for the world record at 1100 feet, so I think my decision to start relatively shallow, for super deep dive standards, is sound practice. Remember, I do not have a death wish. I intend to walk away from this 1100 dive with the record and unharmed. Thank you to everyone who has offered to lend a helping hand. Know that your contribution is appreciated. The very next day, on the 2nd, he posted, "Scouted out a hole here, off the Gulf Coast of Florida. Initial sonar depth readings put the hole at over 300 feet. Excellent news for training. It's a cavern dive though. Very dark, small entrance. Don't know if there's a cave network. I guess I'll know tomorrow or the next day, weather dependent. I'll keep you all informed." This was the moment his fascination with Buzz Spring began. Buzz Spring is a unique underwater anchular-lean cave system located approximately 7 miles west of Homosassa, Florida, in the Gulf. Known for its intricate passages, it provides a rare habitat for cave-adapted marine life. Buzz Spring and similar systems along Florida's Gulf Coast are important for research due to their distinctive conditions and biodiversity, attracting explorers and scientists alike for underwater mapping and biological studies. The cave is a hole right alongside a mangrove island. With the wind and the tide, the entrance was in about 3 feet of water. Once you drop in after a few feet, there is a cavern. Then it drops down to around 110 feet. There is a rough polyline that runs down into the hole that no divers should rely on. These caverns are very common around this area, and although a lot of them are spring-fed or have tidal flow that keeps them fairly clear, Buzz Springs is not one of them. It is very silty. Surprisingly, a lot of divers had been in it, and it has been mapped. Amidst pursuing Project 1100, Jim became a newly certified open water instructor, a role that gave him the title but not necessarily the experience. Jim managed to convince his Advanced Open Water AOW students that he was a skilled technical diver. However, according to accounts from other divers, he lacked experience with critical technical diving skills, such as using helium gas for deep dives or diving with double tanks. So his stories about deep dives were largely fictitious. Jim had convinced his advanced open water students that he was a technical diving expert, yet trained divers who spoke with him knew otherwise. On Sunday, September 30th, 2007, Jim led 2 divers, Harold Arnold, 37, of Crystal River, and Donald Albritton, 26, a local Army recruiter, on a dive from a 29-foot vessel in the Gulf of Mexico, just offshore of Homosassa. The day's plan was to help the men achieve their advanced open water diver certifications, marking what should have been a routine training dive. For reasons unknown, Jim abruptly strayed from the planned dive. Though none of the men was certified for cave diving, he led them into a narrow crack in the Gulf's floor that opened into a cave system known as Buzz Springs. This was an unusual and dangerous choice for an advanced open water class. Jim had been to this cave a few times before since discovering the hole on September the 2nd, as noted in his MySpace blog, and had been able to navigate it in and out without a problem. He likely believed he could guide his students safely in and out as well, or he wouldn't have taken them there. But this decision ultimately put all three divers at serious risk. It's hard to know what would be going through the mind of any instructor to put students' lives in such jeopardy. What they were doing there in the first place is one thing that seems to be totally out of place for an advanced open water class, as caves are intricate overhead environments that require specialized training, which is as a complete opposite to open water. The behavior is so irrational that many suspect narcosis could have been a factor. It is well known that the narcotic effect varies from day to day and even dive to dive. Possibly this was just a bad day for Jim. Jim and his two students began their dive by descending from their boat to a depth of about 30 feet before entering the crack in the seafloor, venturing toward the challenging depths of Buzz Spring. Following this initial descent, Jim's decision to start the dive into Buzz Springs with only a half tank of gas signaled a troubling disregard for one of the most critical cave diving rules, the rule of thirds. This principle mandates that divers use only a third of their air to enter, keeping 2/3 in reserve for a safe exit and emergencies. Beginning with a limited supply left him with little margin for error. Compounding the risk, Jim failed to lay safety lines, place spools, and reels, which are essential to navigate caves and prevent disorientation in low visibility. The lack of these guide points could easily turn a minor silt disturbance into a life-threatening scenario. Additionally, without additional lighting to properly illuminate the cave, or backup equipment specifically suited for cave environments, the divers were plunged into a situation they were unequipped to handle. The students were essentially on a trust me dive, a situation where less experienced divers rely entirely on the skill and judgment of their leader to navigate safely, often beyond their own level of training and preparedness. Passing through a narrow restriction one by one, they moved beyond 40 feet, where the ambient light faded entirely. Visibility ranged from 10 to 40 feet, and the silt along the bottom made it easy for the environment to become clouded quickly. As they followed the permanent line down close to 100 feet, the ceiling and the floor met, resembling a typical Florida sinkhole, but it had a black talcum powder-type silt. Jim abruptly signaled the divers to stop, likely recognizing the risks of continuing with insufficient air and no safety lines for his students. Initially, he may have seen the dive as an opportunity to showcase his expertise and impress his students by pushing them further than before. However, as the depth increased, he likely recognized the dangers of his overconfidence. Without proper precautions in a silt-heavy environment, every misstep magnified the danger, and he may have feared that any further mistakes could quickly escalate into a life-threatening situation for his students. After signaling the divers to stop, Jim abruptly turned around, stirring up a dense cloud of silt, which obscured the line in zero visibility. That was the last time they saw him. Midway through the dive at this point, Jim abandoned the guideline, leaving his students stranded in the dark, and continued descending deeper into the cave. As stated previously, Jim didn't have the proper training. No lights, no reel or spools, or didn't lay a line, and was using single tanks. He was basically solo diving at this point. It's hard to imagine what can possess an instructor, diving with students, to suddenly decide to abandon them and pursue a spot of solo cave diving. The two students, now above Jim, were already making their way out of the cavern. With no proper cave diving training or equipment, they were overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty, The dark, silt-filled waters and Jim's reckless actions left them feeling completely unprepared and increasingly anxious, forcing them to retreat before they too became lost in the depths. Waiting near the entrance, they eventually decided to leave when Jim failed to reappear, reporting the incident to the authorities at 2:24 p.m. after waiting 25 minutes. Authorities from the Sheriff's Office, US Coast Guard, and Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission searched for Jim on Sunday afternoon and Monday morning. It was a certified cave diver from Birds Underwater helping in the search who finally found Jim at 93 feet on Monday at 9 a.m. Unfortunately, this would not be a rescue operation, but a body recovery. Jim was found in a cave off the main cavern. He was not attached to a safety line, which is normal protocol for cave divers, and his air tank was also caught in a rock in the cave. They couldn't tell if Jim had gotten stuck before or after he died. Upon his body recovery, he was brought to a medical examiner official who was waiting at the River Haven Marina, where many of Cummins' friends had gathered. Authorities believe Jim became disorientated during his continued descent and eventually ran out of air while attempting to find his way back to the exit. Narcosis was suspected to have played a major role in his disorientation, causing him to lose focus, abandon the guideline, and separate from his students. A tragic series of events that ultimately led to his air depletion. While diving instructors routinely descend to 90 feet or deeper, narcosis risks increase with depth impairing judgment in varying degrees from diver to diver, especially in an overhead environment like a cave, where visibility and orientation challenges are compounded. The true reason Jim abandoned his students and the guideline to venture deeper into the silt-filled cave may never be fully understood. However, his overconfidence, fueled by his fascination with Buzz Springs ever since he first discovered it, likely played a role. His intrigue with the cave's depths may have driven him to a "since I'm here, I might as well take a look" decision, making Jim push further than he should have, driven by a need to explore more despite the risks. Additionally, perhaps the disbarment had weighed heavily on him, making him careless, ultimately resulting in a mental pause. But whatever the motivation, it was far from wise, especially with two students relying on him and waiting for his return. In the end, the decision to push further in such conditions was reckless from any angle. For Jim's students, the lesson they learned is that cavalier diving can be fatal, no matter how many dives you have done. It proves the point that the first rule of diving is plan your dive and dive your plan. This tragic dive highlighted the risks of reckless diving practices, emphasizing the critical importance of proper training and safety protocols. First, adequate training is essential. None of the divers, including the instructor, had the skills for cave or cavern conditions. Second, safety guidelines, like following a line, were disregarded when the instructor left it behind. Additionally, air management was neglected as Jim entered with only half a tank, and they lacked essential cave diving equipment, like redundant lighting. These mistakes highlighted that previous dives alone cannot replace the need for appropriate training, equipment, and respect for overhead environments. This incident also taught the students that following an instructor doesn't always ensure safety, especially when protocols are ignored. This was a horrible example for two relatively new divers to have to witness. At the time, Jim was the third person who has died in a cave in Citrus County in the past 3 years. The last was in July 2006 when a swimmer ventured into an underwater cave in the Chassahowitzka River and died. Jim was the proud father of 5 children, with their ages ranging from elementary to college level. Despite the challenges he faced, including his recent disbarment, he remained dedicated to being an active and supportive presence in their lives. His love for diving and the ocean served as a backdrop for family bonding, as he often shared his passion with his children. His loss was felt by his family, friends, and the diving community, leaving a void that will not easily be filled. May he rest in peace. This has been Gripping Horror. I hope to see you in the next one.